Hello guys, welcome back to another instructional video. I had a lot of fun recording the 25NL session that you're about to watch and give commentary in real time. And I think it's really important to point out that many of you guys who grind a stake like this, 10NL, 25NL, 50NL, something like this, there are just so many exploits available left, right and center. Your opponents really are playing miles away from a game theory based strategy. And with that, there are a lot of holes in their game that you can just completely destroy if you know what to look for. So hopefully today, by going through the hands that we play and by looking at I think it's 6 or 7 exploitative points that I highlight, illustrated by the hands that come up, you'll be able to add an array of different weapons to your arsenal that you didn't have before, that really pillage your opponents and really expose their biggest weaknesses, of which there are many. Let's get going. So I'm going to be thinking about exploits every single step of the way in this video, guys. It's so important to think exploitatively at these low stakes because your opponents are very far from equilibrium and that opens up a ton of holes in their game. This situation here, I actually think the best exploit is just to bet small. And the reason for this is that people are in general going to be betting a lot when checked to in this sort of spot. The reason being that they're very used to people giving up too much in this situation after checking. What that means is that when I have a hand that's got a little bit going on, in other words, it's not going to be a losing, we can actually just bet this hand, because if we're facing a bet too often, the check EV actually goes down and there's not really a wave continuing against a bet there. Obviously an easy fold to the raise, but this brings us to our first rule of the day for how to destroy the microstakes. One pattern that you should recognize at the microstakes is that when you have a CBet opportunity with a hand that is pretty bad but not totally hopeless, you're probably better off betting than you are checking. This is again because the pool is going to stab a lot when checked to, just having gotten used to an abundance of fold equity in those spots, but is not going to be raising you enough or defending enough in general against a CBet. This is an interesting spot if you look at some opening ranges for 25 no limit, and you can get these at the Carrot Corner store. They're rake sensitive. He'll probably recommend that you fold a hand like King 7 offsuit, or that it's very close to break even if you open it. The thing is, when you have a blue tag that's a recreational player without the full stack, as you can see here, this hand is just clearly winning as an open. There are 2 reasons to this. 1, you will not get 3-bet as frequently by this sort of player as you will by a regular. 2, even the regulars are probably not 3-betting enough in these games if I had to guess about average 3-bet frequency. And actually there's a 3rd reason too. And the 3rd reason here is going to be, just going to CBet here because I'm rambling. This is obviously a hand that you can bet or not on this board. You can use big bets or small. And the 3rd reason for that is just that you have a skill edge. When you have a skill edge, you're just inherently going to be higher EV than a sim would predict. The sim is obviously assuming equal skill edge. This brings us to our second rule of the day. It's so important to avoid the temptation to copy opening charts and ranges. You need to understand that those charts were created with no player having a skill edge over the other. So when you see a weaker player in the big blind and they're not someone who's maniacally 3-betting or something like this, you're going to be able to open all of the break-even hands, the ones that the chart is opening sometimes. And furthermore, you're going to be able to open some of the hands that the chart is never opening, because while these are only slightly minus EV, in theory, they're actually very profitable for you against this weaker foe in the blinds. Guys, I really think that poker has been a badly taught subject for a long time. So many courses, training sites out there that give you an absolute medley of different random content day after day. There's no structure, there's no organization. You're jumping from one thought to another by following along with a live play session. There's almost nothing that's created in a pre-prepared academic way, and that's why I was so incentivized to bring you the Carrot Poker School. Not only do we use presentations to make sure that all ideas are actually translated into concepts, figures, graphics and hand examples and give you the right amount of each, but we also make sure that the syllabuses of our courses flow from episode to episode, not moving at a pace that you guys can't handle. The Carrot Poker School is fully comprehensive. It takes you from the start to the end. By the time you've completed grade 3, there's really nothing that you don't know about the theory of cash game poker. This is so much more efficient than just watching training content from a subscription site that bombards you with random stuff every day. The Carrot Poker School will make sure that you learn at the right pace and that there's absolutely nothing missing in your game. We do not bombard you with extra information that you don't need. We just give you everything you need, and that's a lot, and that's why the Carrot Poker School is 33 hours long. We lead you down the path to success gradually and carefully, making sure that you get feedback every step of the way. This is a revolutionary course, guys. I'm incredibly proud to have brought it to you. You can check it out over at carrotcorner.com. You can save £500 today by picking up our full scholarship and learning cash game poker the right way. You can call or you can 3-bet here. I don't actually think it's a massive deal which one you pick. I would guess that call probably goes up a little bit in EV with this player being in the big blind. And I'd imagine that 3-bet goes down. And the reason for that is probably that this guy is just going to be doing some jamming over a 3-bet. And that's obviously something we can't continue against. I think the jam here is going to be a lot more than what a normal person would call 4-bet with 100 big blind stacks in this situation. So pretty interesting spot. Actually got 2 spots here. Jack 9, we call big blind, we get this flop. This one. When I'm check 2 in position, I think betting here with backdoors, open-ender, with a weaker player in the pot is just generally going to return the highest EV, just juicing a little bit. You can see this as it leads turn on the spade. Obviously there are some flushes, there are some other hands like 2 pair, 1 pair. There's sort of protection betting here. I'm probably just going to go ahead and fold. The trouble is that our outs are often completely dead and this player's erratic enough. It looks like that if they do have a weak range here, they're very often going to bet river. We won't get a bluffing opportunity, so therefore I'm going to fold. And over here we can mix call with raise. I'm just going to call for now. I think this is possibly a recreational player, someone that pots queen 10-3. It's funny because it's not actually a bad thing to use a pot size c-bet on a board like this. I just don't think in practice that many regulars choose this sizing. So this guy could surprise me, they could end up being a reg. But I think for now we're going to assume weaker player. If it's a weaker player, one thing that will be different from an equilibrium right from the sims you guys have studied would be that when you raise the pot size c-bet, they actually like shove or they 3-bet you really big, or they do something like that with a hand like kings or a hand like a set or a draw. And that won't really happen in equilibrium. So reopening the action here by raising against the, let's just say a recreational player's large c-bet is going to cause you to deny yourself your equity more often than it would in equilibrium, because you're going to face that 3-bet. Therefore, we can probably just throw out a exploitative argument for call being better than raise on the flop here. So villain goes into the tank on this turn. And again, in GTO terms, this is going to be a frequent raise this hand. It's going to be doing some raising. It's maybe going to be able to call if the bet is small enough, and it's going to be doing some folding as well. It's definitely what we would call a fringe hand or cuspy hand, facing turn bet. If villain doesn't bet the turn, then you have an automatic river bet. It's very important to understand the game theory of this. If this player checks back the turn, we have to bet the river. Looks like this could be a disconnection that's going on here. I actually have another hand going on, which is the Queen Jack of Diamonds. This is a board that's pretty horrific for range. There's nothing wrong with just checking back all day here. The villain does check back. I think they actually time down. We have lots of different sizes here. I'd normally just overbet with a club in my hand, so I would mix between the big bet and the block bet here. We have some straights like King Jack. We have some 2-pair hands. We just have a lot of good stuff going on, and that's a mandatory bluff spot. Whenever you condense your range on the flop like that and your opponent checks back, you just need to go ahead and bluff the river. There's nothing exploitative about that. This spot though is very exploitative, and I'm going to just pure bet here at 25 NL, because delayed c-bets are just incredible at these stakes. They just work so often, and this brings us to our third rule of the day. If you've been checked out by a Microstakes pool and you have the opportunity to delay the c-bet as a bluff, do it immediately. The fold equity is ridiculously high. It's way higher than it should be in game theory, and giving your opponent the chance to improve or bluff the river is going to hurt your EV when you have such a golden opportunity to bet right now and take the pot down so frequently. Open this hand just to generate a bit of action. You don't have to play this one at all. It's very break even. Again though, if I think I have a skill edge, I can for sure just do this every time. I don't think I'm going to get punished at these stakes so much. King high boards are definitely okay for building a c-bet range on. You can start betting here. I am just going to take the simple option and bet with this hand. This hand has a few frail properties, meaning that if we do check with it and face aggression, it can be a little bit tricky, it can be a little bit awkward. You can check raise, but again, if I think that Marsh, being a recreational player that called hijack, might well just do weird things like bet and then, you know, use a massive 3-bet against my check raise, it puts me off check raising a hand like 5-6 that really doesn't like it when that happens. Therefore, I just choose bet. So you can see that my brain is always kind of scanning the two options. It's saying, okay, in theory, I can check raise this hand, or I can check call this hand, or I can bet this hand. But I actually prefer betting flimsy hands, as I said in rule 1, against this pool because of what happens sometimes when you take lines like check raise, and based on how often they just end up stabbing in general. The more often they stab, the worse it's going to get for us. Two hands here. Another thing that you can do when you think you have a skill edge is just widen this button 3-bet range slightly, expecting this player to not meet the 4-bet quota that they're supposed to meet. I think that's a very normal thing to suppose, is that the average player will be under 4-betting. Some people will be over 4-betting, some people will be 4-betting optimally. This hand is not even much of a stretch to 3-bet. It's what we'd call an optional 3-bet. In GTO terms, it's break even. Therefore, if I just say, hey, I'm P. Clark, look at me, I have a skill edge against you, you suck, I'm great, then I already have enough incentive to go ahead and 3-bet the hand. That in and of itself is enough to make it a pure 3-bet if my mission is to just maximize EV in the here and now, which it is. And this brings us to our fourth rule. When you're in position and figure to have a skill edge against your opponent, or you feel like your opponent may be someone that's a bit too passive and unlikely to find enough 4-bet bluffs, it's important to widen that 3-bet range. Even if your opponent calls a lot of 3-bets out of position, they're not going to be doing amazingly. It's going to be very hard for them to play post-flop. So the only way that they can adequately protect themselves against rampant 3-betting by an in-position player is to 4-bet a lot. Microstakes pools simply don't do this enough, so widen that 3-bet range. Stop following the charts. Back over here, we have a hand that is decent enough to check. I'm not going to bother randomizing today so much. I would normally randomize the spot and do a little bit of bet probably, but it's a high frequency check for sure. And my thought with this is just that the hand is robust enough to handle aggression. It's not a flimsy hand like some backdoor 1-over card holding that I just want to CBet because I'm worried about facing too many stabs. On the turn, it's very important that you don't bet here. Theoretically, this would be a huge polarization error. This would absolutely sink your win rate if you did this too often. And on the river, the idea here is that you could check this hand in equilibrium, but I'm not going to. And the reason I'm not going to is I think that, well, first off, this player looks tight, but more importantly and more generally useful for you guys is the idea that the check back twice range is too capped, and it will not be enough hands actually value betting here in villain's range. Therefore, I'm just going to hope that villain has something like a queen, and I'm going to overbet here. I do unblock a queen. I think it's very unlikely they have a king or better, but I also think it's quite unlikely that they're going to do enough bluffing or value betting if I actually decide to check there. And this brings us to our next rule. Opponents at the microstakes can and often will be too passive on the river. This means that if you get to the river with a value betting candidate, and it's a spot where a solver may well tell you that you can slow play and go for that tricky, trappy check raise, it may be better just to outright bet. This is because the level of aggression you're going to see from your opponents is just not going to be adequate in this spot to make checking a good idea. So get those value bets in and don't worry too much about it. Defend Jack 10 here in the big blind against button. This is a spot where there was a bit of confusion in the last video that I posted on Tuesday, which was people were saying, well, this board's massively better if your opponent. Well, yes, in terms of equity, sure, but when they actually check behind on the flop, they forfeit their nut advantage, they keep their equity advantage, they lose the nut advantage. This allows us to use some very big sizes. Now, whether I fire river or not, in game theory, is going to be a function of my blockers. I actually think that going all in here is a relatively decent play with many Jack 10 combos. I'm not going to take it with this one, and the reason for that sizing would be that many of my value bets are 7 here. So I do structure like a very big overbet in this spot. The reason I won't do it with this one is I have blockers to the heart draw, which bricked, and just some of the folding range in general. I also think villain is playing some queen jack, jack 10, queen 10 combos this way, so I'm not sure this is the fantastic spot. I also don't block I do block jack 7. I don't think it's that relevant in that spot, so I'm going to forgo the bluff on that opportunity. 8s here, you can do anything. I'm just going to call because I was short of time. You can build a calling range in the small blind here. You don't have to. But yeah, it's important to understand that when you get to a spot with a very uncapped range against a very capped one, these gigantic sizes are good theoretically, and there's no reason to reject them exploitatively either. One exploit you could maybe use is to go slightly smaller sometimes when you're bluffing against soft player pools. So instead of using like an overbet that's 4x pot, you could just go like 2.5x pot and expect kind of similar results. In other words, your opponents might not be elastic enough to sizing once you get up to that very big point. So another exploit here is that I'm never going to mix check here because I don't think pool is going to be aggressive enough. I'm just going to make this overbet and then jam river. You can definitely check here in GTO, and there are some reasons for this. This is really close now. Like, we have to really react to what's just happened. We don't have a lot of time here either. How thin will this be to value bet? Probably not that thin. It depends what size I pick. One safe thing that you can always do in these spots is block bet. It's just a safe way of making sure that you don't completely value time yourself. If you go for a massive bet there, you're in danger of creating a scenario where your equity plummets too much when called. We'll talk about this a bit more. So this hand is quite straightforward, but there's definitely an important teaching point here concerning the river. We start off with a fairly ordinary check raise in this situation, which is definitely how we want to play the bottom set, and blocking a lot of villains' bet call range, and generally just wanting to fast play when out of position with this type of combo, just standard bread and butter poker. On the turn, this is where I think it gets interesting. We block certain hands in villains' range here that would be calling but not betting, so we block something like 8-9. What that usually means is that you can do a bit of slow play, and I'm sure that GTO will mix check here and it'll go for like the double check raise, usually, depending on villain sizing. The reason I don't want to do that is that I don't think people are going to be aggressive enough on this card in particular. After I check here, I don't think they'll make enough sort of small thinner value bets. I think that they will probably overfold on the flop in the first place, pushing their range away from air hands and a bit more towards just showdown value hands. So I'm quite confident that the highest EV play in reality against this pool is just to go ahead and bet here, even though if you look up a sim it will tell you that the check is okay. And this is a skill that's very important to try to hone. The idea that just because a sim tells you, or solver, or whatever program you're using to study GTO tells you that you can do X line or Y line, one of them might actually be worse than the other significantly in reality based on the differences, the fluctuations between how humans play the spot and how solvers do, right? What we're essentially doing as poker players when we blend theory with practice is we're trying to understand what the options would be. Is it a mix? Is it a pure action, theoretically? And then do I have a reason to deviate? And here I think you're definitely not going to face enough aggression here to make check as good. Basically, it's going to go check, check too often. And then if you jam 4x pot on a deuce of diamonds river, I actually think that's going to be really overfolded too. So not only are you going to face check too often, but you're probably not going to be able to recoup the money by then 4x potting river as effectively as you would be able to in GTO. So key differences here. We go for the overbet. This just sets up roughly 1-to-1 SPR, though that's not important. You don't have to get this exactly right. Sometimes students at this level obsess way too much about it being neat or it being under pot on the river, and I even hear people say things like, oh, your sizing is a mistake because it's not geometric enough. People love to use this word, geometric. I've got a math teacher who's one of my students who's assured me that that is the wrong term to use for this kind of concept anyway, so I've stopped using it, but it doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't matter in the first place whether you have 77 left here or 62. It's a slightly different scenario, and you have to handle it in a slightly different way, but either one is fine. So the problem with jamming here is it's obviously way too thin, right? Like if we jam here, we start to get called way too often by hands like 10-9. We do block 8-9, which has now become a good thing. It was a bad thing. We also have the 8 of spades, which makes a lot of combos impossible in villain's range that ordinarily we'd be worried about, like 9-8 of spades, 10-8 of spades, Jack-8, Queen-8, and Ace-8 of spades. Given that we block those, I think this hand can go for thin value. Without a spade here, I think this would be way closer. I just opt to use a very small bet. There is no floor on how low your bet can be. If you want to bet 5 big blinds out of position into this pot, go for it. You're allowed to do that. In position, it becomes more silly because then you're just reopening the action with minimal gain. But out of position, the thing is that the action is already open. So you can go for a very small bet without doing anything bad to yourself, without sabotaging yourself as you would if you did this in position, granting your opponent a bet opportunity, raise opportunity they wouldn't ordinarily have if you checked. Another situation where the board being rainbow makes it worse. Because the rank of the board is so good for villain and so bad for us, we'd rather it was two-tone or monotone so we can dilute some of that badness that comes in rank with flush potential. As I've said before, these checking ranges on the turn are far too weak. They're classically just very, very weak at these stakes, and therefore we can value bet a lot thinner. I think the 6 river is a nail in the coffin though. Most rivers we're going to bet twice, but we need to adapt to this one and understand that we don't want to bet on this. When a villain leads here, I'm just going to fold. This is another really, yeah, I'm glad this came up actually. He leads small. The thing is, this is still a bluff catcher. Like, we're not going to see 10x lead here. Anyone that's got this in their inventory is probably a reasonable player. You can tell by the percentage pot of the bet size here. I'm actually going to go ahead and fold. I only need 20% equity to call, but something has woken my opponent up there. They don't really have any misdraws. They have to be turning some kind of pair or showdown value into a bluff in order for me to want to call there. And this brings us to another very important rule about how to destroy the microstakes. When you face aggression in a spot that's a little bit offbeat, or maybe your opponent's already had to jump through a few hoops to reach the situation and has filtered their range in a certain way, these situations are usually going to be under-bluffed by Microstakes pools, especially where it looks like it's very difficult for them to naturally find air hands to bluff with. In these spots, you're going to win much less often than you're supposed to in GTO, and the best way to start out here is with a policy of always folding every bluff catcher in your range. Have fun folding. Kind of an awkward SPR for the ace queen offsuit. You can 3-bet and get this in. I think I prefer call. The reason is that if I 3-bet and get this in, it's never going to be amazing, and I'm not really going to be able to use any kind of skill edge that I have. So in other words, my skill edge against this opponent exists to a far greater extent in the branches where I just call pre. So that's what I'm going to do. Yes, in theory you can do either, and if you look at this in a pre-flop solver, or if you buy one of the solve ranges on the Carrot Corner store, it's going to tell you that you can 3-bet this or you can call it, but it's going to mostly call, right? Because it doesn't want to 3-bet mediocre hands at a very high frequency. It just becomes quite exploitable to 4-betting and things if you do that. Oh, it's Hey Arnold. Awesome show from back in the day. That takes me right back. I expect that the spot is CBet too frequently by pool, and therefore this is going to be closer than normal to ace queen. This is super close. I'm going to peel here, and I think that a recreational player just CBets too much. And this is one of the skill edge things I'm talking about. I don't normally get to peel here. This is another skill edge thing I'm talking about. When they do this, they're just gonna have a value hand all the time. They're gonna be too merged. They're gonna have like jacks, and they're terrified about me having 7s or something like that and having redraw. But the fact that my opponent is capable of this kind of misplay is all the evidence I need to say that I want to call pre-flop. I want to allow them to make mistakes. This brings us to our final rule for the day. If you have a choice between a line where you can use your skill edge and a line where you really can't because you're just investing a ton of money immediately, you probably want to prolong the hand and grant the maximum number of opportunities for you to outplay your weaker opponent. This is very common at the Microstakes, so make sure you pay attention for this pattern. Remember, if you like this format, do let me know down in the comments so I can continue to choose this as a production here on the YouTube channel, Carrot Corner Poker Education. The Carrot Poker School is live. Your final notification for today that you can save £500 on our full scholarship by heading over to carrotcorner.com right now, as well as exploring all of the other products on our educational store. See you for the next video. It's now Tuesdays and Fridays, guys. 2 days a week. We're upping our YouTube game. I look forward to having you guys along for the journey. See you soon. Bye for now.